Welcome to episode 2 of the Asymmetrical series. If you followed from the last episode, you should have a lobby and your two maps. So, in this episode, we will be doing the scripting portion. So, we're going to go to server script service and insert a new script. I'm going to call it main script, but it doesn't matter what you name it. So the very first thing we're going to want in our script are going to be some variables to make the scripting more organized for us. So one of the variables we're going to want down the line is the map folder. I'm going to do players first because I need access to the player service for a lot of what we're going to be doing. Next thing is the server storage. As you can see, our maps folder is inside there. So we're going to make a variable for that as well. And now we're going to grab maps inside server storage. So we're going to do map folder and we're going to wait for it so it doesn't bug out on us. And the next thing we're going to want for an asymmetrical game is a variable for the amount of players we need before the game can begin. So I'm doing mine as amount to start, and I'm going to set it as 2 since I need 2 players minimum. And I'm going to put a little comment there by doing 2 dashes. Next, we're going to create our actual game loop so that the game will recycle over and over and over. So the loop I'm going to be using is a while task.wait loop. And the reason I'm using this loop is because it doesn't loop over itself. It'll run each line in order and wait in order. So before the game can begin, the very first thing we want to do inside our loop is get a player count and see if we have enough players to actually begin any game sequence. I'm actually going to do a player list instead because I want to be able to get the amount of players. Normally you could do players get players. However, I need it to be valid players, and Roblox doesn't not return characters if they don't have a character. You'll see what I'm talking about in a bit. I'm putting a number /pound sign in front of the table, so I convert it to a number of the stuff inside that table. So now we're going to create a function so that we can not have an empty table for player list. Here I'm going to create my own custom get player since Roblox's get players will bug out on us. In this get players, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to create a list, and we're going to do a for loop to go through every player that is actually in the game by using Roblox's get players. But unlike Roblox's get players, we're going to check for the characters. And if they do have a character, then we're going to insert them into that temporary list. Now that list is filled with players that have actual characters, we're going to return the list. And we're going to go down here and replace that empty table with the function instead, which should make player list equal to every player that has a character in game. And basically what the loop is doing is it's getting players with characters every single moment, and it's comparing it to the amount to start. If the amount to start is less than or equal to the list, then we print what's inside. Now, as you saw, I didn't have any prints because I was one person, so I'm going to do multi-testing with 2 players. Now you see the 2 clients show up. We go back to the server, and now it's saying we can begin over and over and over because it's just looping and taking the table again and again. So now that I know it gets to this part of the code, I want it to only run once and not run over and over like that. So we're gonna do a repeat loop, and we're gonna put 1 = 2 as the condition before it can loop again, since we don't have enough variables to set a custom condition yet. we'll change this later on to be actual game win conditions. Now that we have a start sequence, what we're going to do at the very start of our game is we're going to want to get a killer. So in order to do that, we're going to need to get an index from that player list. So we're doing a math.random, and we're starting with 1 since it's the smallest amount on the list, and we're doing the amount of players in that list with the number player lists again. And now we're going to get a chosen killer by going into the player list and using the index that we got from the line before. And this should return a player at random. And immediately after that, we're going to remove the player that was chosen using the index from the player list. So at this point, the code now has chosen killer as a killer, so we should be able to print a different killer every time we load the game, and it'll only print once because we have that repeat loop down there. So to test this out, we're going to print it. As you can see, they both finally loaded, and now it printed player 2, and it only printed once. It works perfectly. Now that we have a killer and we have a list of potential survivors, we need to make new functions so that we can set them up into the game. So we're going to do a function for killers and a different function for survivors, so we don't have to rewrite the code for each one. So inside each function, we're going to send a player. And the very first thing we're going to want to do for both functions is we're going to want to get the character, since that's where I'm going to store the values in this game. And we're going to set a character attribute to survivor to true for survivors, since they're survivors obviously. And this is going to also be how we read how many survivors are left in the game, by looking at all the characters and seeing if they have this attribute later on. As for the killer, we're going to copy and paste this entire thing into the killer, but because they're not a survivor, we're going to change that attribute to killer instead. Now that that's done, because we only have one killer, we can just do setup killer and then put chosen killer inside there. And now the killer will be set up with this character. But because we can have more than one survivor, we're going to have to loop through the entire player list for every potential survivor. So we're going to do a for loop, and we're going to do it on the player list this time. And set up survivor and put in the player. Now, if you were following from last episode, you remember we planned a value system. I've stripped my values down somewhat. I need a value for survivor called got hit. It needs to be a boolean, and I also have one for got fused, which will also be a boolean. And then I have one for killer, which I plan on making a number that'll grow over time. So in order to do this the easiest way possible, we're going to make a folder, and we're going to call it killer values. And we're going to make another folder, and we're going to call that one survivor values. So inside the survivor value folder, we're going to put in the booleans we wanted, aka bool values. And I'm going to name this one to got hit, and I'm going to name the next one to got fuse. Now that I'm done with the survivor, I'm going to go into the killer, and this time I need an int value so I can have a number instead. And this will be called current strength. Now that I have those set up, I don't need that anymore, so I'm deleting it. And now to put the actual values inside the characters themselves, what we're going to want to do is we're going to get the folders by doing script wait for child, folder name, and we're going to clone it and set its parent to the character. And if we copy and paste that into the survivor and change it from killer values to survivor values, it should work for them just as well. Now we're going to quickly test it and see if it works perfectly. As you can see, I went to player 1, they have killer values inside them, and their killer attribute is true. If we go to player 2, their attribute for survivor is true, and they have the survivor values. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. In the next episode, we'll be finishing off the game loop and spawning in the maps and spawning the players into the maps. And we'll also be changing the loop condition to a win condition for the killer.